Good afternoon. I'm Alistair Barclay. It's going to be a joint presentation. Gareth will take over halfway through. The point of the talk, what we're hoping to examine, is how farming gets established in early prehistory, and to demonstrate the point that this wasn't a quick process, but actually quite a slow process that lasted for millennia. And we are, to demonstrate this, we're going to talk about one project and its implications, which is Kingsmead, Quarry, Horton. Now, the site itself is a gravel quarry, a project that's been running for over 10 years now. The location is just to the west of London, just about 5 kilometres from Heathrow, for those who don't know the area, not far from Windsor. It's actually located just inside Berkshire and next to SAL. Just to locate the site with other significant finds of Neolithic date, there is the Staines or Yeoveney Lodge causewayed enclosure by the River Thames. And we're just to the west, less than 5 kilometres from the Stanwell Cursus, which sits under Heathrow Airport, or part of it sits under Heathrow Airport. And just to give you a bit of background on the quarry, this is the quarry. It's about a kilometre long, and it covers about 34 hectares. As I said, we've been working at the quarry since 2003. We do get to excavate everything within the quarry, and that is significant, as you'll come on to realise with the discoveries we've made. Our final year will be this year, when we excavate the 4 areas to the north, and then our work will be complete, and this will be published in a series of 3 monographs over the coming years. The project itself has been generously funded to the sum of £4 million for the archaeology by our client Senex UK. Our discoveries are multi-period. They go back 12,000 to around about 12,000 BC. It's a multi-period site. We have everything from late Paleolithic, Mesolithic, all the way through to post-medieval. And these are just some of the significant finds. We have a very important beaker burial, which we'll mention later on, barrows, some very interesting Bronze Age finds, Bronze Age farmsteads, a Bronze Age field system. We also have an Iron Age riverside settlement, a Roman farmstead. But what I want to focus on first is one of the most important discoveries, and not the only discovery, which is a series of 4 early Neolithic houses. For those people not familiar with this period, houses at this time are very rare. We only know about 15 examples from England. There are a lot more known from Ireland, and a similar number from Scotland. From Ireland, there's at least 70. To find one house would be very unusual. The main point for Horton is so far we've found 4, which you can see. We found these 4 over the last 5 years. And it's these houses that I want to talk about first. So far we've found 4 houses. These are all early Neolithic in date, and I'll come on to talk about the significance. The houses belong to a period right at the start of the early Neolithic. So we're talking about the first few centuries of the 4th millennium BC. So far we've found two types of houses, which I'll come on and describe. As you can see here, two have foundation slots and two are post built, probably with wattled walls. And we're looking at two different types of traditional building structures. And again, Horton's unusual, obviously, in that we've got these two types on the one side. One common feature, as I've highlighted here, is these buildings seem to be arranged around settings of 6 posts. The first of these structures we found in 2008. This structure is about 5 metres by 8 metres. Now, when we excavated this, we found traces staining the highlighted areas here, and in the sections seem to be darker soil, which our interpretation is this is decayed, possibly oak planks. Now, I mentioned the Irish houses. Significantly, about half of the Irish houses seem to have burnt down, and therefore preserving charred planks, the sort of stubs of charred planks. And this house here, as you'll see later on, is very similar to some of the Irish examples. This house, in terms of the finds recovered, we found quite a lot of broken bits of pottery, part of a flake from a Group 6 or Cumbrian polished axe, also bone points. Significantly, we also had some charred cereal remains that we've radiocarbon dated, and also tiny fragments of animal bone. And you'll notice I've referred to this as a house, I think, because we 100% sampled the foundation trenches of this structure. We've got an awful lot of debris from... I'm reasonably convinced that people were living. It is a dwelling. We're finding the rubbish that has made its way into the wall slots as people have swept the floor, or simply, you know, objects have got broken and things have got trapped in those wall slots. As I mentioned, we found that house in 2008. In 2012, we found a very similar but larger structure, the one we call Horton 2. Before excavation, we did a MAGSUS survey of the area, and this highlighted 2 gaps in the wall there that we see as an entranceway. And the readings suggest potentially that although no floor surfaces were preserved, and sometimes you're lucky to find halves, we didn't actually find any evidence for that. Our sites have all been truncated. But where it's highlighted in red, potentially the signal here is indicating that they could have been sweeping the ashes out of the doorway. This is as I mentioned, a much bigger structure. This is about 40 metres. A number of these buildings are in keeping with other houses in Britain and Ireland, arranged around 2 rooms, as you can see here. The other defining features of these 2 buildings, we have slightly bowed ends, and also more substantial. It appears that one of the walls could have been almost facade-like, with built out of more substantial timbers. And the significance there, and there's a connection maybe with other types of monuments like long barrows that also have facades. We've also noticed that one of the rooms, the footings tend to be more substantial, and our interpretation here is that half of the building may have had an upper story, maybe for storage or for sleeping. This is the second house, and as I mentioned, when you find these things, our policy was to 100% sample them, which is what you can see is going on here. It's very important, as I say, the question, are they dwellings, to recover as much artifactual evidence as you can to support that interpretation. And these are some of the finds from the larger second house. Slightly different from the first house in that we recovered a number of leaf-shaped arrowheads, including some broken examples, a number of worked stones, a rubber stone here, maybe to go with a quern for grinding corn. And at the bottom here, some fairly typical ill-sorted flint-anchored early Neolithic bowl pottery. I think it's very subtle, and that people talk about signatures in terms of collections of finds from houses. I think because we don't have surviving floor surfaces, there is a slight difference between what we've recovered from this house and the first house. Whether that means there was a different range of activities going on between the two structures, I think it's difficult really to say, but there is a marked difference. And this is one of our reconstructions of what the house may have looked like. Just to give a better impression, I think it's very difficult to, when you just look at plans, to appreciate what these structures, in terms of experiencing them and seeing them as a sort of dwelling where people may have lived and what activities were taking place. It's probably easier to visualise it from such 3D images rather than just the plans. As I said, we've based this on some of the Irish examples where the preservation is better, where they've got bits of charred wood remaining. In terms of the woodworking, there are structures like the Sweet Track, which is also from Somerset, which is also of early Neolithic date, which is quite a complicated trackway preserved in peat. And I think there are clues there to woodworking techniques when it comes to looking at how they could have constructed these buildings. There are clues in the timber joints that survive in the timbers in that structure. And then just some other images of maybe what the house could have appeared like. And here we're showing the possible upper story that may, again, it's just an interpretation. And then the other houses, as I mentioned at the beginning, these two are post-built, maybe a different style of construction from the first two. House 3 we found in 2010, and House 4, or the possible House 4, we found in 2012. Obviously, all we have are the post holes, so the opportunities to recover finds were a lot less. House 4 was mostly associated with early Neolithic pottery as well as a few flints. House 3 was associated with very little material, a few worked flints, a flint core, some charred hazelnut shell from some of the post holes. The remarkable thing about House 3, though, is its similarity to a site in Derbyshire, Lismore Fields. And here we've superimposed House 3 over Building 1 at Lismore Fields. Building 1 is actually the original semi-detached Neolithic house in that it's actually 2 buildings. But as you can see here, the plans are almost identical. Now this is significant if you stop to think about it, because we've not found many of these houses. The sites are 150 miles apart, but you might want to think about how did somebody build a or lay out a near identical structure over such distance. And does this actually mean, are we looking simply at the fact that we're not finding these houses? It's a very strange coincidence that could have significant implications for the early Neolithic and what we're not finding from the archaeological record. And again, just to show what the difference between the 2 houses, again, this is based on work that's been done on the Irish houses. As well as the houses, we've also found what we call a house void based on other people's work. And the house void is an arrangement of pits about 30 metres from the first house we found. And we noticed these have been recognised elsewhere. And one of the things about early Neolithic houses is we haven't found that many. They appear at the start of the Neolithic, and then after a few centuries, houses disappear, or rather the evidence for houses disappears. I think with these house voids, and if we are genuinely looking at spaces that were occupied by houses, it might give us a clue. Clearly people still had to live in dwellings, that after a few centuries they gave up on investing quite a bit of effort in building a house and probably could have reverted to building maybe a less substantial structure, perhaps something like a yurt. The finds from these pits, again, early Neolithic. We know from radiocarbon dates that these pits are slightly later. The pottery we see here is ripple burnished pottery, the same type of pottery that's been found at the Staines Causeway enclosure. And just to prove the similarity, we put the house and the pits together, remarkably similar in the area that they enclose. Another reconstruction. One of the things we can't demonstrate, and I'll say more about this in a few minutes, how many of these houses were in use at any one time. But this reconstruction shows one house in use and a second house being built in the background. Now, these are slightly less than a dozen radiocarbon dates we have so far from 3 of the 4 houses and the house void. We do struggle at Horton is on brick earth, and sadly this means that we can't date any bone. There's no collagen surviving, or very little collagen survives in the bone from this site. And this really restricts what we can actually radiocarbon date, which is rather unfortunate because we do have significant deposits of both animal bone, animal burials, and I think we have about 50 prehistoric burials as well. We have about a 1 in 5 chance of dating any bone on the site, on one side of the site as well. Most of what we can date then, or what's left in terms of sample material, is charred remains. And the problem there is you don't find that much charred material in the early Neolithic, or certainly not on this site. But, so the result is of our 3 houses we can date. As you can see from the scale at the bottom here, our first house seems to have been constructed after 3,800, and less precisely house 3 round about 3,600. So we're talking about a period of the Neolithic right at the beginning. We're in the first few centuries when farming was first either taken up or introduced. Now, for Horton and the Horton area, we know that farming practices had already been around maybe for a century. We know they were using pottery on other sites, slightly earlier types of pottery, carinated bowl. So we also know from Horton we have very little Mesolithic material. So it does look as if this is people moving in to a new area of landscape, as far as we can tell so far. I don't think we're looking at pioneer farms. As I say, they've already adopted Neolithic practices. But we are looking at a new community moving into this area. I think the houses are very important. The houses are part of adopting this Neolithic lifestyle. The houses are part of becoming Neolithic. And at the top of the slide, these are the dates for the pits that make up the house void. So slightly later. The other significant thing here, although it's only based on one date, Horton 3, the house that's similar to Lismore Fields, is quite late. And here, although we shouldn't really accept the evidence just from one radiocarbon date, the suggestion is we could potentially be looking at overlap with other monuments, causewayed enclosures and long barrows. This is important that there are houses around when they're building monuments. And generally the houses from Horton, other houses that have been radiocarbon dated are much earlier, a century or so. Collectively, these are quite late. And the implication being that there could be overlap, that the houses don't disappear before they start building monuments. They're building houses and building monuments using monuments. And just as a comparison, some of the other structures from southern England, the 4 Horton houses across the top there, and some of the other recognisable structures from various sites. I'm going to mention just 2. Cranford Lane, which is only about 10 kilometres away on the other side of Heathrow Airport, and also Gorhambury, which is further up the Colne Valley, right at the head of the valley. Again, you can see from the plans quite similar structures. Now, I think that the group at the top we can recognise as houses. They're smaller. The other structures we find in southern England and also in Scotland are much larger. So the 2 from southern England, Yarnton near Oxford, as you can see, a very substantial structure. And also Whitehorse Stowe, one of 2 structures that were found recently, about 10 years ago in Kent, on the route of High Speed 1 of the Channel Tunnel rail link. I think these structures are more like halls. There's a big debate as to the function of these structures. Are they houses? Are they halls? Are they large houses? I think the answer is, well, some of them are halls, some of them are houses. You know, it's much more complicated than one or the other. And then just a plot, just to show the dimensions of the Horton houses, just to give you an idea of the size. There's Balbrigdy, a famous Scottish hall, one of the real sort of halls or monster houses. And as I've said, our interpretation, these were spaces for living and doing sort of everyday tasks. I think it's possible that the larger structure, and I'll come on to talk about this, sorry, just to show the reconstruction again, and, you know, just to make the point again that we have to see these as three-dimensional, you know, sort of see them as buildings and not just look at them in two dimensions. In terms of function, our interpretation here, sort of how they were used, living, working, storage, working, I think it probably would be more complicated than that. You know, these spaces, the use probably changed as routines changed throughout the day, and I'm sure they organised the space in a very flexible way. I think the larger house here, it's possible that this also served as possibly as a sort of meeting place, occasional meeting place for the wider or extended community as well. So it may have had a double function, a place where people gathered to celebrate on certain occasions. Now, House 3 is not far from our only monument of the same dates. And interestingly, we have what we interpret as a feasting deposit in the ditch of this monument, made up of freshly broken pottery and a substantial amount of animal bone. We can't prove this because we can't radiocarbon date the bone, unfortunately. But of course we've got to think, where did the rubbish go? If these are dwellings, what did people do with their rubbish? Well, one possibility is that some of the rubbish from these houses ended up in this monument and possibly other monuments that we don't know about, that simply haven't survived or haven't been discovered. And then returning to the significance of the number of houses, I think if we'd only found one house at Horton, it would have been a lot easier to explain. The fact that we've found 4, possibly 2 clusters of buildings, it's very surprising, I think, for England. It's more common in Ireland, but I think we are looking at sort of small hamlets, and we're also potentially looking at a sort of sequence of buildings as well. From the radiocarbon dates, although I have to emphasise we can't be that precise because we only have half a dozen or so dates, and we can't prove how many houses were in existence at any one time. But it does give us a clue from the information we have that this settlement may have only lasted for 100 or so years. So I think it's quite likely that these structures were in existence at the same time. If we look at the Irish evidence, we get a similar pattern of clusters of houses, long houses, as you see here, with other shorter houses, and not that different from what we have at Horton. Again, long and shorter houses. So are we looking at one principal dwelling, maybe where the sort of head of the community lived, and then other satellite dwellings where other members of the extended family household lived? And this isn't unique. Returning to Lismore Fields, the same thing. A smaller, almost square structure, and then what may have become more of a longhouse, the extension, 2 buildings built back to back. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Gareth.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to take the talk forward a little bit and look at the next 2,000 years or so. Just to put the site into context at this time, the red dots show our 4 different houses. So we're looking at a largely unenclosed landscape, an open landscape. As Alistair mentioned earlier, we've got our early Neolithic enclosure, our only monument of the state, which also contains some lovely moor-like ware. We also had a relatively significant cluster of grooveware pits at the southwestern corner of the site. A significant late Neolithic burial just to the immediate west of our house build. As Alistair mentioned, radiocarbon dates of this of our bone can be quite poor, but we got a very good date from this burial. And also 3 significant early Bronze Age features. We only have 3 features of this date. The one to the north and the one to the south, represented by 2 barrows, and in the centre, a significant early Bronze Age beaker burial, including the beaker pots, amber beads, about 70 lignite beads, and 5 gold beads. This is significant, given the area is extremely rare in this part of the world. But we have an explosion of activity in the Middle Bronze Age. The landscape goes from one completely unenclosed, with the old monuments scattered around, to complete transformation of the landscape. Across the excavation, this is the only period that covers the entire site. Within this area, we've been able to highlight 2 farmsteads, which I'll come on to talk about, and we've divided the landscape also into different land holdings, different areas of use. But I just want to focus on, before I talk about the Middle Bronze Age, about a very significant feature of the early to Middle Bronze Age that was found to the immediate west of Farmstead A. And this was in the area of the grooveware pits. It was by far the largest of the grooveware pits. It was about 3 times the size of all the others. And here it is. We get a very good radiocarbon date from the lower fills, which also contains fragments of amber. Significantly, in the upper fills, we have this strange burnt deposit, and the pink dots actually refer to objects that were found in a radial arrangement. We can just make out the arrowheads and pieces there. And this is the arrangement of the finds. When this was first found, it was thought to be a toolmaker's kit, but on further inspection, it's actually a collection, quite a significant collection. The arrowheads are all used, they're all completely different and have different flints. You've actually got some late glacial flints in there, notably this one. There's a scraper there as well, but we also have this Middle Bronze Age bone wall. So quite a significant feature and a significant deposit. Now it's significant when you look at the area. In the southwestern part of the site, repeated activity, people repeatedly going back there. This is the area of grooveware pits, highlighted here. And then we have the action of the early to Middle Bronze Age feature, cut into the top of the grooveware pit, and then the establishment of a Middle Bronze Age farmstead. Now the early to Middle Bronze Age pit with all the arrowheads may have acted as some sort of foundation deposit before the inception of the farmstead. Before I start talking about the farmsteads, just highlight one other significant find of this date that we had. This is right at the northern part of the site. just placed in the bottom of an enclosure ditch was a human skull, just sat upright on the base of the ditch. Nothing else around it, from a very well dated ditch, I should say. And it was just sat in association with a sheep mandible. On closer inspection of the skull, you just see this lesion beneath the nose. We've had Jackie McKinley look at this, and it's gone to various universities, etc., around the country, and it's thought that this is the earliest case of leprosy found in the country. Possibly tuberculosis, but likely to be leprosy. And also, before I start talking about the farmsteads, this image on the left just shows the distribution of Middle Bronze Age pottery across the site. As you can see quite clearly, highlights the two farmsteads. Gives a range of the different types of vessels that we have, from globular ends right through to bucket ends. Significantly, we have associated located very close to one of the early Bronze Age boroughs. We had a cremation cemetery, both earned and unurned. The earned ones within bucket ends, and we also had inhumations in that area. So just to highlight, the two clusters of pottery indicate our two farmsteads. And the area in green there is an area that we've excavated last year. Quite a high dense area of activity. Probably not another farmstead, but an area of settlements with associated water holes. Also another human skull in a ditch. And we've yet to analyse that. So just focusing on the two farmsteads in turn. Clearly a very agricultural landscape. Subdivided into enclosures. We have the area of settlement to the west of the farmsteads. A significant number of cattle burials, predominantly located around enclosure 7. We actually have 12 burials, possibly an indication of the importance of cattle to this group. We have the single inhumation of that of a small child in a well-struck fire deposit. But it's actually at our waterholes where we get our best dating, particularly in the southern part of the site. We actually have 4 significant features, including this one, which contained the complete globular urn with 5 lugs for suspension. This was interesting. We had a radiocarbon date from the charred material on the inside of the pots, which was 100 years or so earlier than that of the fill that was found right at the base of the feature. We have a recurrent theme, Alistair touched on it before, a recurrent theme of curated items, old items being deposited much later, as suggested also in the arrowheads pit that I showed you earlier. So this is a close-up of the settlement area. We have clear structural evidence on the site. We actually have, to date, we have 7 roundhouses. They're all around 3.5 metres in diameter. Various post hole groups and fence lines also found. And our radiocarbon dates from the farmstead 1, farmstead A, are very nice. Give a range of around 100 years or so, the lifespan of the farm. Found in the upper fields of one of the enclosure ditches was a very nice quick-headed pin. Quite rare to find them in such a context, often found in hoards. This is almost seen as like a closing deposit, possibly found in the upper fields of the ditch and seemingly discarded, but a very nice find. And there's a reconstruction of farmstead A with two structures. The pin would have been is in this sort of area. And moving quickly on to farmstead B, very similar in style and date. Also found some structural evidence, the old fence line, post hole groups, 4 water holes in each corner, and a very significant find in this segmented ditch at the southern edge of the enclosure 4. And it was that of a Picardy pin, or Picardy pin, just found discarded in the upper fields of the ditch, a beautifully incised decorated pin with a slight S-shaped curve. Also, I should point out at this point, in the top of the pin, we actually found some sort of like glue-like residue. We didn't actually find anything else, possibly helves or amber or glass, possibly. Like I said, we didn't find them. And just to indicate where the goodie is, often these pins are found in the Somme Valley or the Thames Valley. So it's highly likely that ours actually came from France. And we've had metallurgical analysis which does suggest the metal was French in origin. So it's likely that the pin was actually from France. And there's a reconstruction of farmstead B. There you can see farmstead A in the background. So very close together. Now, the benefits of such a large excavation, we're able to look at such wide areas, and it's sometimes almost the blank areas are just as important and just as interesting as the denser areas. Throughout our excavations, as we're heading north over the years, we saw this very clear definition of busy areas and areas which was being specifically kept clear and open. In 2010 we found the early Bronze Age barrow there, the associated cremation cemetery, and there's also a timber structure there. We found in 2011 we found this very strange U-shaped enclosure with a water hole in the corner. The feature was about 2 to 3 times the depth of any other Middle Bronze Age feature on the site. Looked almost Neolithic in nature. And we've kind of term this our open area, or dare I say a ritual area, area that's being specifically kept clear from the normal activities of the farmstead for some reason. Possibly areas of living, areas of dead, etc. Now, also of interest within this area, this is our early Bronze Age barrow and associated cremation cemetery here. We also had a Middle Bronze Age timber structure, 3 times the size of all of our other structures. Significantly, this one had a northeast facing entranceway as opposed to a southeast facing entranceway. And we imagine it to be some sort of communal structure, and the entranceway actually looks out over to our Middle Neolithic monument. These are our radio commentaries from the site so far. Collectively, as Alistair said, we're still working on the analysis and still obtaining more dates. But it shows that the 2 farmsteads are broadly contemporary and appear to have lasted for around 100 years or so. So very short-lived settlements. Now, during this time, other excavations have also found comparable evidence to ours, and it shows a level of prosperity in the Middle Bronze Age. This is spatially accurate, so you have Horton on the left, T5 in the centre, and the Wessex archaeology excavations at Imperial College. And if you actually look at those collectively, very similar. Our first initial looks at the radiocarbon dates suggest that they're broadly contemporary, and poses the questions of organisation, why such a large area is being subdivided at this time, who is controlling this, and what were the social implications of actually going from a completely unenclosed landscape to such a subdivided landscape. So I'll give you as all of our Middle Bronze Age metalwork from the site. This also has connotations as to what was going out for such items to come into our very small scale farmsteads. Perhaps cattle was significant to our culture at this time, as we've seen. Cattle burials were buried around farmstead A. Perhaps that was the surplus that was actually being used for trade. So that's, as we've seen, like the huge significance of the two periods leading from the Neolithic right through to the Bronze Age. We have our a period of settlement in the early Neolithic. But then we have very little activity, very little idea of farming or settlement, but we do have a monumental activity during this time, and then the complete transformation of the landscape during the Middle Bronze Age. Thank you. Just to highlight, acknowledge, as Alistair mentioned, Senex. We'd like to thank them for all their help, and our friends at Berkshire Archaeology and Guildhouse Consultants. Thank you.
Okay, I will endeavour to fill Morris's shoes this week, which will be a tough job, I know. Now, do we have any questions for our speakers tonight?
Hello, Richard Hughes. I'm all surprised by how crude the form is of the Neolithic houses. Given that if you go anywhere in India or Africa, people that are relatively poor living in rural communities are able to precisely lay out similar sorts of structures. Is there a good reason for that? Is it that they're just being rather quick and crude and not taking much time and effort over it? Or is there another reason? That's one question. The second question is, I note that English Heritage and the Stonehenge Centre are going along the route of building Neolithic houses with wattle and daub. Given that you've got a good supply of brick earth at the site, is there any evidence at all for wattle and daub there?
Regulars will know that we take all the questions first, and then the lecturers put together a little sort of mini lecture and then the answer. Who else had the question?
Mark Hansel. Yes, rather following on from the last point, the only sort of Neolithic rectangular houses that I was aware of, but I'm not a prehistorian, are the ones at Durrington Walls, and perhaps one of you could say something about the relationship, if any, between your structures and the ones there. Incidentally, apparently we're at the equinox, so if you've got anything on sort of ritual feasting, I would be interested to hear that.
John Landrish, what about, in the broadest sense, some continental structures have things in common with these as to dimension, as to the fact that the A horizon of your soil seems to be missing, you don't have any floors, you say, and is this at the same depth of the middle and early Neolithic, or do you have any more? We don't have any floors at all. And sesquipedal houses in the 5th millennium have some evidence for half upper sleeping areas perched up. Do you have any more direct evidence for this than a rather nice drawing?
Would you like to comment on whether or not there's anything significant about the location of the early Neolithic houses within the floodplain of the Cone Valley, and how that might relate to the distribution of monuments more widely within the Heathrow area?
Anybody else? I've got one comment. Well, a couple of comments. I'll save those for summing up. But one question. It's a detailed one. The relationship between the Grooveware pit and your peculiar pit with the Barb Tang arrowheads in. Mm-hmm. You said that the pit with the Barb Tang is a cut of Grooveware pit. Well, that's exactly the same relationship as pertaining to the pit with the Aurochs burial with Barb Tang arrowheads in, and the Grooveware pit just north of Heathrow. And I wondered if you had radiocarbon dates from the Grooveware pit and your funny Barb Tang pit. And because we didn't get that from the other one. I just wondered if you could see any time interval between the two. Anybody else?
Someone else had the hand up, John. Do you still want to?
It was a very ignorant question. I wondered about, years and years ago, when I was at the London Museum, my husband helped the people at Berkshire with an introduction about prehistoric landscape, and he simply edited something. And I remember there was evidence about weather, changing weather conditions, and also it's related to the Carl Valley question, actually, and also about the kinds of crops that weren't being grown and the landscape. And you showed a reconstruction. I apologise if this is something known for everybody in the room, but is there much known about the landscape, certainly at the later period that you're talking about?
Last one.
It's just a very broad question, really. I see Horton as being in the Colne Valley. The results add to some extraordinarily widespread excavations in the Colne Valley. I think it just demonstrates the value of doing these large-scale projects. It's just a general question as to whether, with your knowledge of the archaeology of the Colne Valley and the Thames Valley, whether there's anything markedly different about the prehistoric settlement and occupation of the Colne Valley as opposed to the Thames Valley.
Okay.
I'll start with the broad question first. The difference between the Colne Valley and other areas of the Thames Valley. Very striking difference if you think Avebury sits at the head of Kennet and other parts of the Upper Thames where you get clusters of long barrows. I think it is different. I think what we have in the Colne Valley, the fact that we have, whether it's a substantial cursus monument with a central bank or a bank barrow, is, we are looking at a sort of area of activity in the Neolithic that does actually rival Avebury and other main sort of ceremonial centres. In the context of, so the monuments are different, and I think we need to start looking, we all know now that the Wessex model for the Neolithic is wrong, that it doesn't apply to so many of our river valleys. I think we need to sort of move on from that and sort of look at the Colne Valley again, why there are so few houses. Generally, as I said, there's only 14 or 15 believable structures as far as I'm concerned for the whole of England. Why do we not find more? Why have we found so many at Horton? And I think the fact that there is another possible structure at Cranford Lane, which is only 10 kilometres away. There's also the structure at Gorhambury, which I'm trying to remember, 20 kilometres or more than that. What else are we not seeing? And more importantly, how do we actually go out and find Neolithic houses? I think when you consider the size, Horton's a big excavation, a kilometre's a large hole, but it's not really that big when you look at the size of England. And I think the challenge is, so many of these houses are found by accident. Has anybody, I don't think anybody's ever tried to find a really Neolithic house, have they? And how would you go about it? Where would you start looking? But that's the challenge. You can say we've done plenty of these large-scale excavations, but again, that's still very random. It's still, it's not a strategy for going out and looking for these things. I think the fact that we have got 3 sites in the Colne Valley and the number of structures at Horton probably does mean that there are other ones out there. moving on to our reconstructions, yes, we have. I suppose we've been influenced by other people's drawings. I'm sure we know, if we look at trying to think, although it's a long way away, but if we look at Eastern Europe, if we look at tell sites where they have much better preservation, where they have collapsed walls, there's even sites with evidence for windows, where they've got preserved floors and preserved kilns. I think our structures are probably far too crude. And it's really our perception that there is very little evidence for what these structures would have looked like. And I think it's a fair comment, we simply don't know, and ours probably are too crude, too simplistic. But it's only an impression. We do, one of the things I've not had time to do, but I mentioned the sweep track, and if you look at the timbers that make up the sweep track, there are carpentry joints there. You can see what they're capable of doing with wood at this time. And I don't think anybody yet has gone back and sort of looked at the evidence for timber working around about this time. And that would give us a good clue of what they would be capable of making in terms of the building. The Dorrington Walls houses, these are much later. We're talking about houses belonging to a period that's at least 1,000 years.
Okay.
I think getting on for 1,000 years later on. They're very different. I think it's significant again, we have the same problem. I mentioned the evidence for houses disappears. Dorrington's the same, although they've found quite a few houses at Dorrington of late Neolithic date. We've probably found there are certainly less sites from England with late Neolithic houses than there are early Neolithic houses. But the houses are very different, they've got very good preservation, they have got floors, they've got evidence for the walls, much more evidence than what we have for the actual structure. The evidence for crops, we have some evidence for cereal from the early Neolithic. The interesting point here, and this is a general comment, although you find cereal in the early Neolithic, and going back to the subject matter of the talk, the evidence for cereal cultivation appears at the start of the early Neolithic, but then more or less disappears. There's then we know quite a lot about what the crops they were growing, the cereal, for a few centuries, and then we know increasingly from radiocarbon, there's then very little evidence for cereal cultivation. It's not just that we don't find the charred cereal or cereal remains. In the early Neolithic we find quernstones. The quernstones more or less disappear. These things only reappear really in the early Bronze Age in significant numbers.
Yeah, just some of the points. The one regarding wattle and daub. We did have limited evidence of daub in one of the houses, House 3. One that looked very similar to the example from Lismore Fields. It was quite limited, that's all I can say. We didn't have any from the other houses. From House 4, the one that was actually only 6 post holes, we actually only recovered pottery, a reasonable quantity of pottery, but nothing else, other than some other work from we had a bed or a tip. And scrape from that. So we do have limited evidence of wattle. in terms of the hearth evidence, unfortunately the nature of the site being 34 hectares, the way we have to excavate the sites with machinery, large-scale machinery, and does limit the possibility for us finding floor surfaces, although they were excavated very carefully, largely by myself. The site has also been relatively heavily ploughed, which also causes a problem. This year, actually, in one of the areas that we will be excavating is immediately south of Hatch 1. And Alistair and I have been talking about a strategy of trying some test pitting before we actually go in with machinery. And one thing that we don't have evidence of, or either, is middle material. The only type of middle material that we have is in the early to middle Neolithic U-shaped enclosure very close to House 3. So our hope is that maybe we'll be able to pick something up. But as I said, the site has been heavily ploughed and farmed, and there was also actually over House 1 there was actually a pig farm. So it was quite remarkable that we have such preservation there anyway. John, your question about the groove-wet pits. The large groove-wet pits, initially we have very good radiocommon data from the initial pits. Off the top of my head, I think we have radiocommon for the burnt material, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
Can you tell me what I mean afterwards? Just tell me, because it's
no,
a
I
really
think it comes out around about 1600.
Yeah.
It's slightly earlier than the dates on the farm estate. And I think just a slight correction of Gareth mentioned the pin. The pin is bronze, not bone.
Did I say bone?
He did. Peter Northover has analysed that pin. We know the composition fits with the Middle Bronze Age, so we know, there is evidence that the arrowheads are much older than.
It's a security deposit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 1600. So you took too late for that. Yeah.
That's all.
Okay, Zach.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. For what it's worth, I think that yes, the Middle Thames is different to the Upper Thames, most certainly. But what you've shown, especially the Middle Bronze Age, is that the field systems that are existent in the Colne, certainly that part of the Colne Valley, are spread all the way across the gravel terraces of the Middle Thames and the Heathrow. And the work done by others show they occur wherever you dig. They're probably underneath here. We're probably sitting in the middle of the Bronze Age field. It stretches all the way down through the Middle Thames, underneath London. In fact, I often think of London, this will cheer Marker, as a sort of intellectual and physical blot of prehistoric landscape, inflicted on us by the Romans. If Londinium wasn't here, then we'd have a fantastic prehistoric landscape going all the way down through central London. And what we're seeing on the outer edge, I think, is simply the peripheral edges in sort of eastern Berkshire and old rural Middlesex of something that was much, much more extensive. And I think that the change probably comes as you move north onto the claylands, away from the rich brick earth gravel terraces. The prehistoric complex, the Neolithic complex, one of the things you sort of touched on was that there are a number of other prehistoric Neolithic quarter enclosures, aren't there, along that bit of the Thames. And also that massive enclosure down at Mayfield Farm, just south of Heathrow, which I think is also a quarter enclosure, others disagree. But yeah, Alistair's right that for so long things have been dominated by Wessex, but we are moving on beyond that now. And we can see that certainly that western edge of London is a Neolithic landscape to rival many others in Britain, and who knows what, unfortunately, we've lost as we move down through central London. What else was buried underneath here? So I just want to say thank you very much to our speakers for showing what fantastic results large-scale excavation in sort of the development process can achieve, and how we're now getting to the stage where what were once thought to be single large landscape projects in their own right, such as Terminal 5 and Imperial College, are now starting to fit together to produce an atlas, prehistoric atlas of certainly of the Middle Thames, but these massive projects all starting to link together so we can start to produce an atlas and excavations of our past. Thank you very much indeed.